Hi friends, my name is Host Eric and I am a 50-year-old man absurdly clinging to the coolness of youth, oblivious to the pity and dismissal of all those around me. In addition, I'm the world's greatest typologist, and today I'm going to bring you some important news about cognitive functions. Let's see what I have to say, shall we? Let's look at this picture. These are the four fields. Inside your head, internal communication. Outside your mouth, external communication. Inside your body, internal experience. Outside your body, external experience. Objects on this communication level have one kind of identity. Objects on the experiential level have another kind of identity, which is to say they have attributes. How do we know this? What does that mean? Well, it means this. If you were to describe something by its physical attributes, such as an elephant, you'd say it's a large gray thing with big floppy ears and a really long nose. And people would say, oh, you're talking about an elephant. However, I can do that I can give you the attributes of the thing, and you can determine the identity. Now let's look at a YouTube video instead. Well, here are the attributes. It was uploaded in 1080 HD, and it has a duration of 23 minutes 45 seconds, and it includes no timestamps. And now you're not going to be able to identify the video, right? Because the video's identity is comprises its meanings and the actual experience of viewing it or consuming it. It's a durational object. It's a time object. So that's the difference between the kind of objects that each kind of function deals with. So your communication functions deal with objects of identity. That's to say they're binary. It's either an elephant or it isn't. It doesn't matter how much you injure or maim the elephant so that it doesn't have any of its attributes anymore, it's still an elephant. Whereas physical objects are understood to have attributes. That is to say, it doesn't matter what you say in terms of identity, logic, or whatever, I'm still going to experience the ongoing grief of losing a loved one, for example, for some stretch of time. It's not a matter that's a definitional matter. It's an experiential matter. And lots of things in life are like that. You'll note here I've got some terms on the side. I'm not going to read through them all, but I might read through ones that are relevant here. So, attribute, a measurable quality of an object, height, weight, duration, etc. Identity, a distinction indicating unique among others of the same kind. Example, Howard's rock has an identity. A rock has an identity. It says it does not. I mean, well, it does, but it has an identity in the sense that this is not a rock. So in that regard, we deal with those terms definitionally as binaries. Now, it's difficult to say exactly what qualifies as meeting all the necessary conditions to be defined as meow. But it's much easier to say when something fails to meet a necessary condition to be meow. So, well, all apples are fruit. That thing is a mammal. Therefore, it fails to meet a necessary condition to be an apple, as mammals and fruits are exclusive. Okay, identity then is really a word that we use to describe things that can be understood linguistically through parsing, one way or the other, and not so much proper nouns. That just includes one category of those things. Okay, let's go on to the next slide before I spend too much time on this. So let's look at this picture. Actors. The thing about cognitive functions that people need to remember is no matter what kind of type you are, it means you have chosen to make a sacrifice, or have naturally, your configuration sacrifices something. So actors, people like NEDOMs, SEDOMs, that's INTPs, ENFPs, ESFPs, ESTPs. They either cannot be precise with words, or they cannot be precise with experience. That's what it means to have either TI or FI polar. Knowers, they either can't figure out how to do shit, or they can't figure out how to be socially aware or graceful. It's necessarily the case because they're knowing in both ways. When you're 1/8, if you're SI dom, you also have NI in the 8th. when knowledge comprises so much of your conscious and unconscious attention, then as a consequence, figuring out has to be limited to one frame of reference. Deliberators, they either can't establish ideas or they can't execute them. That one's the neatest, tidiest one of these, right? Interfacers either can't link to experience or can't link to identity. So, in other words, well, let's go on to the next page here and look at this one. And let me just hide the terms for a second and bring myself back up. All right, so both TE and FE engage with the external fields. TE engages dynamic systems down here and puts and gets objects here. So the real interface quality of it is done with the systems themselves, but the reason we have TE and FE is basically a way for people to translate dynamic systems from one, either communicative or experiential dynamic systems, into objects that can be communicated and or gleaned information about. So in other words, FE engages systems here, systems being a particular kind of object in this framework, whereas FE establishes and gets objects from here. So FE reads your facial expressions from here, but engages you meaningfully here almost always. So it's like somebody come to you mad at you, you might get that object down here, see their, and you might take it back up here and say, well, why are you mad at me? Let's talk this. I am so sorry. Make a big kowtowing apology and stuff, and maybe maybe you did incur their wrath, but maybe you can be forgiven. In this case, they're engaging the dynamic systems here, and they establish objects here. So this is like me at work thinking about how to put together a curriculum for a given speech event, and then turn it into actual lesson plans that I can hand to other people and they know what I mean. Okay, so let's go over to the next one. So this is kind of messy, but as you can see, NE establishes objects here and establishes objects here. SE impacts objects here and impacts objects here. And the reason for this is, why doesn't SE get to establish? Why does it only impact? Because there's no creation or destruction of matter and energy, really, right? So it's like, it's not like the total amount of matter increases in the world. It's just people do different things to it. So SE is about impacting the kinds of objects that are experiential objects. They don't have attributes, but that have, they don't have identity, but that have attributes. And as a consequence, they don't so much establish objects as they do impact objects. NE is the genuinely creative function. Prior to making this video, it didn't exist. It's new. The total amount of matter in the world hasn't increased, but the total amount of metaphysical matter certainly has. So what this shows is, to be an NE or an SE DOM, you need to sacrifice parsing of objects up there or down there. Now, if you are balanced or consistent with your dominant, then you're NETI, and you establish objects the same place you parse them. If you're inconsistent or unbalanced, or perhaps you might say, or balanced. So like if you are unbalanced, that means you're too heavily metaphysical or too heavily physical, okay? So INTP is maximally unbalanced, so they establish and parse objects the same place. A balanced approach would be an ENFP, who establishes objects up there but parses experiential objects. Another balanced approach would be ESTP, who impacts objects down there but parses them up there. And then the last unbalanced approach would be ESFP, who impacts objects the same place they parse them. Okay, let's go to the next one. So these are NI and SI, and let me pull up the terms again. So what you see here is SI links these kind of objects to experience. That is to say, in this instance, objects of identity. And down on the bottom left-hand corner, it links those objects to experience. Recall relevant past. So, in other words, when you link objects to experience on the bottom half there, the SI part that's in the bottom left-hand corner, which is physical internal, what does that mean? Well, it means that you have had an association. So if you drive by some place where once you really embarrassed yourself, and every time you drive by that place, you remember it, that's an SI link to experience from a given piece of data. Okay? So, and it's linking an experiential object in that instance. So, you might be driving by someplace, but it's linking not to someplace near where you're driving by or someplace else in the actual world. It's linking to something that happened before. SI here links these objects to experience. These are identity-based objects. So in other words, SI people are, SI third is especially good at memorizing stuff, word for word, verbatim. Whereas NI has more trouble memorizing things word for word, verbatim, but they can tell you what the gist of the thing said, right? NI links these kind of objects, that is to say, external field metaphysical objects or objects of identity. To know on both external fields is to sacrifice one interfacing on the external fields. So because NI knows on both external fields, that means they can only interface on one external field. They're either FE or TE. And then they have to treat the other external field as static. That's what it basically boils down to, is FE treats the physical world as static and the metaphysical as dynamic, and TE treats the physical world as dynamic and the metaphysical as static. Okay, so to know on both internal fields is to sacrifice one interfacing function. Same thing. So the point is, we think about knowledge functions as being inside of you, most private, but introverted intuition is actually your intuition about things outside of you. Introverted sensing is your acquired personal experience and extrapolations you've drawn from there, probably without good reason. Both of these things can be right or wrong depending on the context. Some contexts are appropriate for SI and some contexts are appropriate for NI. When Rachel, for example, looks at something in astrology that suggests that maybe she and I are compatible, I say, why don't you look to your actual experience for the last year and see if we demonstrate that incompatibility, right? That would be an example where SI would be a more pertinent thing to use. Okay, let's move forward. TI-FI. So TI parses those objects up there in the metaphysical planes. That's to say, objects of identity, objects in which you can be binary about them. This is right, this is wrong. You can have this or you can have this, but you can't have both. Exclusiveness is built into communicative attentional manners because to communicate requires exclusiveness. I have to mean something specific if I'm going to meaningfully convey information to you. So, in order, though, to parse both metaphysical fields is to sacrifice one of the actions types. So, in other words, if you are TINE, you can generate and parse ideas, but you can never execute them. If you are FINE, you can parse emotionally and generate ideas, but you can never execute them, more or less. And not never, but polar's pretty blind. If you are TISE, you can parse ideas, but you can never generate them. And you can parse and execute ideas, but you can never generate them. If you are FISE, you can parse and execute experiential data, but you can never generate ideas. So that explains that. Now let's go to the next one. This is where they all land then. basically. Well, not basically. This is where they all land. Don't add unnecessary words like basically, Eric. This is where they all land. So the thing about that is, you'll note there are 3 functions in the internal physical field that are native to the internal physical field. There are 3 functions that are native to the internal metaphysical field, but there are 5 each for the external fields. Why is this? Why isn't there symmetry? Because we have a lot more information to deal with outside of us than we do inside of us. So inside of me, I need to keep track of my own experience. I need to be able to do my own parsing, either logically or emotionally, or both. Sometimes you can have it like, if you got 1 8, you really got both going on. It's just that the 8th one is really subservient to the first. And as far as my own shit, I need to know my memories of what happened before and my body's well-being. So that's your SI in the head and then the body. SE, I can do stuff to myself, right? I can get myself a tattoo. I can accidentally hurt myself, etc. But I can also do stuff to the external world. NE, it needs to be on the internal metaphysical field, because a lot of times I come up with ideas before I say them out loud. Sometimes I have to write, like almost always, I have to write them down, or else I just get stuck in a little loop without moving forward. But then, so it's extrovert intuition is most native to the external metaphysical field. What do I mean by most native? I mean, it's what it's meant to do. It's meant to put information there. But in order to successfully put information there, you need a holding area or a staging area, and that's why NE is on the internal metaphysical field as well. Note, NI is external, not because it doesn't occur within your head. All of these functions are ways that an individual pays attention. All attentional manners are of the individual or of the subject. There is no attentional manner outside of yourself. Okay? Remember, you are paying attention to these various fields or on these various fields. So the reason we have TIFE, TE, NI, NE on the external metaphysical field is because there is a need to parse not only logical information there, but to know identities, to put information there, NE, and TE uses that field to drop off and get objects. Basically, it says, okay, I figured out how to do this. Here's some instructions for you. Or, I need help figuring out component 6 of my project here. Let me get information from the external metaphysical field to help me with it. Extroverted feeling, it's the opposite, as I indicated. So this is why it's 5533. Interestingly, it adds up to 16. I just figured out where they all belong, then put them down, then looked at it and said, 5533. So make of it what you will. Obviously, each of the functions additionally has its role. So we talked about TI and FI being parsing functions. If we were to maximally reduce that to its role in a model, we'd say they are getting information. NE and SE are action functions that either create or impact either language objects or physical real world realities. But what was I saying? Where was I going with this? So as a consequence, they put information. They're in both instances, the information flow is this way. In TI and FI, the information flow is this way. In other words, I seek and get information. With NI and SI, I receive information. So in other words, when I say, what is this? You say mouse. It just appears. You receive the answer. Okay? You don't have to think about it. You don't have to get it from any place else. You just simply receive it from your intuition. If I say, what did you have for breakfast today? You receive that information. You might have to go, and try to think back. But once you land upon the piece of information, it's certain. It doesn't need to be parsed. There's no figuring it out. You might have to take a little time to process the request, the search request, but you either know it or you don't. It's received information. And then lastly, the interfacers, they're handshake kind of functions, which is to say they are primarily functions that engage dynamically with systems that require a dynamic approach. Not all systems do. If you're an action deliberator type, you prefer systems that don't require a dynamic approach. Court requires no dynamic approach. I don't have to have any conversations with people. I wait for my turn, I take my turn, and I say my piece. Sit down, you know. Extroverted feeling is one which requires you to instead interface with the people, not just exchange words and parse the words. And as a consequence, it needs to get and put information on the physical field, but it only engages the dynamics of the system on the metaphysical field with language. So hopefully that is clarifying of things. Just remember that all attentional manners, we can think of them as having some relationship with some kind of object. And there are fundamentally two kinds of objects: physical objects and metaphysical objects. This video is an object that has identity. You could tell anybody in the world all of the attributes of it, but if you don't tell them the name or what it's about or the name of the channel, they're never going to figure out what you're talking about. So, and of course, you'll note as well that as a metaphysical object, it's not subject to the normal law of non-contradiction. In other words, multiple instances of it occur and exist in the same time, place, and context, and, which violates the law of non-contradiction. It exists for you on your computer and it exists for me on my computer concurrently and separately, the same thing. So, you know, if we were to accept the rules of the physical world for all things, we would say it's not possible. That violates the law of non-contradiction. How can it be in two different places at once? Well, because it's not a physical object, and therefore it's not subject to the limitations of objects defined by attributes, but rather it's an object of identity, or what you might call an entity instead. So, thanks for watching, and here. Does this make you take me more seriously or less seriously? I wanted to find out before I left. You could leave that in the comments. Does the wig and glasses make you take me less seriously? If I were wearing a more mature and dignified shirt, would you take me more seriously? I want to know. I want you to ask yourself those questions. And if so, why? Everything I just said makes such good sense, right? What difference does it make what I'm wearing?